Ida Marsh had set out tea for the annual assembly every September for 26 years, and she knew Hales Crossing the way a woman knows a house she has never left, not by its rooms alone, but by its sounds, its weight, the particular quality of its silences. She knew the creak of the walled garden gate when the wind came off the river. She knew how the tenants gathered nearest the yew hedge when they were uncertain, and the hour the light fell golden across the kitchen terrace and turned the flagstones the color of good bread. What she had not known, until that September morning, was that the men who owned all of it would come home 8 months early and walk through the gate not 5 minutes before the assembly was called to order. She saw him before anyone else did. She was carrying the first tray of cups from the kitchen passage when the gate swung open, that low creak, that familiar complaint of iron, and Rowan Hale stepped through. He was dressed plainly, a coat still carrying the dust of the road, and he stood for a moment with his hand still on the gate latch, reading the garden with the particular attention of a man who has been away long enough to notice everything. Ida's tray did not waver. But her breath did. She had been present at Hales Crossing when Rowan's father died and when Rowan was called away to the Northern Holding 8 months prior. She knew, as well as any person on the grounds could know, what it was to carry a place in your chest like a compass and be too far from home to trust it. She had watched the men grow from a boy who ate too much of her apple cake to the men who now stood in the gateway, still, watchful, the dust of the road on his collar, his eyes moving across the assembly he had not been expected to attend. Around him, the tenants nearest the gate registered his presence in the manner of people who have learned not to show surprise in front of power. A murmur moved outward through the garden like a stone dropped in still water, and then the garden grew quieter than it had any right to be on a warm September morning. At the far edge of the assembly, near the low wall where the kitchen garden gave way to the walled orchard, a woman in a plain work jacket stood with her hands clasped before her and watched the gate. She was not among the tenants Ida recognized from the assembly rolls. 7 months prior, when the old head groundskeeper had retired with his bad knee and 50 years of service, this woman had been promoted quietly from assistant to head on a Tuesday afternoon, with no ceremony and very little introduction. Ida knew her name, Nora Finch, because Ida made it her business to know the name of every person who ate in the kitchen or worked within the garden walls. She knew that the woman arrived early, stayed late, kept the estate's land records in better order than they had been in years, and never seemed to require anyone's permission to do what needed doing. She did not know yet what Nora Finch's father had done for 30 years. That was still to come. Gerald Hale presented himself at the center of the garden at the stroke of 10, as he had presented himself at the center of every gathering for the past 8 months, with an ease that Ida had quietly distrusted since the first week of Rowan's absence, when Gerald had rearranged the household seating at dinner with no instruction from anyone to do so. He was a man who wore authority the way some men wear a coat that belongs to someone else, adjusting it constantly, smoothing the lapels, hoping no one would notice the shoulders didn't quite fit. He had noticed Rowan at the gate. Ida saw the flicker cross his face and disappear behind a practiced smile. He produced the deed from inside his coat and held it at a height that allowed the assembled tenants to see it without quite being able to read it. He spoke of Rowan's late father with a warmth that would have moved Ida if she had not learned to measure Gerald's warmth the way she measured cooking wine, useful in proportion, suspect in excess. He spoke of a long-standing intention, a gift of land from father to nephew, the South Meadow parcel and the river mill, formalized in the autumn of bereavement and never yet acted upon. He spoke as a man wrapping a conclusion in enough preceding sentiment that the conclusion itself might pass unexamined. The walled garden was quiet. Ida set the second tray down on the terrace table without sound and watched. Rowan Hale stood at the edge of the assembly nearest the gate, his face composed in the manner of a man listening to something he has not yet decided how to answer. The tenants nearest him did not fidget. The ones farthest from him did, slightly, and then stopped. It was into this particular silence, weighted, collective, the silence of a room full of people who have made the calculation that speaking is more dangerous than not, that Nora Finch stepped forward. She did not raise her voice. She did not gesture toward the deed or toward Gerald. She gave her name first, clearly, Nora Finch, head groundskeeper, and then she said that she had one practical question, if it might be permitted, before the matter was settled. She said it the way her father must have said things, Ida would think later, not as a challenge, not as an accusation, but as a person who has been taught that the purpose of a question is to find out what is true. She asked whether the estate's land registry copy might be produced alongside the deed, so that the two instruments could be set beside each other for comparison. As her father had always put it, she said, a deed and its registry entry were meant to be read as a pair. Gerald's smile did not change. But something behind it did. He said that the registry copy was a formality, that the deed was sufficient on its own, that the matter had already been reviewed. Nora said she understood, and that she was certain he was right, and that producing the registry copy would therefore take very little time and would leave no question unanswered. She said it with such plain reasonableness that refusing her felt, in the moment, like refusing to open a window to prove there was nothing outside it. The estate's strong-room key was held by the household secretary, a meticulous woman of 60 who had never, in Ida's recollection, been known to misplace anything or decline a reasonable request. She produced the registry book within 10 minutes. The assembled tenants and staff waited with the patience of people who sense they are present at something they will remember. Nora set the open registry book beside the deed on the terrace table. She did not speak for a moment. Then she placed one finger on the registry's last entry for that autumn, and one finger on the date at the head of the deed, and she said only that the instruments appeared to have been made 3 weeks apart. The last entry in the registry for that autumn, her father's hand, meticulous and faded, was dated the 14th. The deed Gerald had produced was dated the 5th of the following month. Rowan Hale's father had died on the 20th. The deed had been written 15 days after the man who supposedly signed it was buried in the estate's churchyard. There was no corresponding registry entry. There was only the gap where one should have been, and the silence of the walled garden, which was now a different kind of silence than it had been before. Gerald Hale said 3 things after that, in a voice that had lost its earlier warmth and become something thinner and harder, like a length of wood found to be rotten at the center. None of the 3 things were adequate. The household secretary closed the registry book with care. 2 of the estate's longtime men of business, who had made the journey from the neighboring town for the assembly and spent the morning quietly disapproving of Gerald's manner without knowing precisely why, stepped forward to manage what came next. The matter was referred to the family's solicitors. Gerald Hale left the grounds of Hale's Crossing inside the hour, and he did not return. Ida Marsh stood on the kitchen terrace and watched all of it, and she felt, in the way that long years of service sometimes permits, a particular satisfaction, not at the exposure itself, which was painful in the manner of all necessary things, but at the fact of the gardens having been set right. She watched Rowan Hale stand for a moment at the center of the garden after Gerald was gone. The tenants and staff had drawn back by instinct, giving him the room that a man like him occupied without asking for it. The assembly dissolved into smaller clusters of quiet conversation, the way a disturbed pool settles before it stills. He crossed the garden to Nora Finch. Ida could not hear what was said. The distance was too great, and both of them spoke at the register of people who do not require an audience. But she watched it the way she had watched Hale's Crossing for 26 years, with the attention of someone who knows that the important things are often smaller than the dramatic ones, and worth more. She saw him ask something. She saw Nora answer without hurry, her hands at her sides, her posture unchanged, neither diminished by the occasion nor enlarged by it. She saw him go still in the manner she had learned to read in the Hale men across 3 generations, not coldness, but the stillness of a person absorbing something that has changed the shape of what they know. He asked more. She answered again. At one point she turned slightly toward the garden wall, toward the land records office visible over the stone, and said something with a gesture, not a dramatic one, simply the gesture of a woman indicating a place she knows well. Later, in the kitchen, Ida pieced together what had been said from the fragments Nora offered without theater or self-importance over the washing up. Nora's father, Thomas Finch, had been the land registrar for the Hale estate for 28 years. He had retired when his eyes failed him and died the following winter, leaving his daughter, who had spent her girlhood at his elbow, cross-checking instruments and learning that a date and a signature were only as good as the record beside them, with an understanding of land documents that no formal schooling could have improved upon. She had come to Hale's Crossing 7 months ago because the estate had advertised for an assistant groundskeeper, because she had grown up knowing its land as well as any map, and because she had nowhere better to be after her father died. She had recognized the South Meadow parcel in Gerald's description the moment she heard it. She had recognized her father's notation in the registry the moment she opened the book. The rest was simply a matter of setting the 2 things beside each other and asking the question she had been taught to ask. Rowan Hale had stood in the garden and listened to all of this, and then been quiet long enough that Nora had moved to excuse herself. There was still the terrace furniture to be secured before the afternoon rain. He had asked her to wait. He had asked whether she knew that the position of estate land warden, a role her father had held under a different title, combining the records work with the grounds, had been vacant since Thomas Finch retired, unfilled because no one had been found who could do both parts properly. She had said she had not known that. He had asked whether she might consider it. Ida, hearing this in the kitchen, had set down the cup she was drying and looked out the window at the walled garden, where the September light moved across the flagstones, warm and unhurried. The position was not a small thing to offer. It was the work her father had done, restored to his daughter, with a weight and permanence behind it that Gerald's 8 months of comfortable rearranging had never come close to. Nora had accepted. She had also answered the second question, whether she would be willing to teach him what her father had known about reading the estate's instruments, the cross-referencing, the habit of the paired document. He had said it was clear he needed to understand it better than he did. He said this without embarrassment, the way a man says a true thing when he has decided it is more useful to say it than to protect himself from it. Nora had said she thought that could be arranged. Ida Marsh finished the last of the assembly cups and hung her towel by the range and looked out at the walled garden, where the light was softening toward afternoon and the yew hedge was throwing its long shadow across the flagstones. In 26 years she had watched Hales crossing through 3 generations of the family, seen it at its best and its most diminished, and come to understand that the difference between the two was almost always a matter of who was trusted and who was not. The land registrar's daughter had been at the estate for 7 months. No one had introduced her to the men whose grounds she kept. She had arrived without ceremony, worked without audience, and known from the first week every instrument in the strong room and every parcel of ground by its number and its history. She had stood at the edge of the walled garden and asked one question, and the thing that could not stand in the light of a true record had not been able to stand. Rowan Hale had crossed the garden to find out who she was, and what he had found was the daughter of the men his family had trusted most, who had spent her life learning to protect what her father had spent his life recording. Ida thought Thomas Finch, wherever he was, would have considered that a fair outcome. She put the kettle on for the afternoon and went back to her work, and outside in the walled garden the last of the light crossed the flagstones and the river wind moved through the yew hedge and Hales Crossing settled into itself, quiet, whole, and correctly ordered, for the first time in 8 months.